2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 says this, for godly grief, and there's a difference between godly grief and worldly grief at the end we'll get to, but for godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. He says there's a godly grief. Now the grief is the emotion. The grief is, man, when I make a mistake, I know I made a mistake, and there's emotion attached to that. I know that I was wrong, but a godly grief says, I'm not frustrated or guilty about myself. I'm guilty, but instead there's a brokenness about my choice. And because there's a brokenness about my choice, there's a godly grief that leads to a changing of my mind. In the story, the prodigal son picks up. He says, I know that I've messed up, and I know my father's servants have it better than I do. And he sets off to go home. He says, I want to go and make things right. There's action. It's not about emotion, it's about motion. It says that godly grief in our life, the emotion, produces repentance. So the emotion produces motion. And the motion, it says, leads to salvation. That's a life without regret. Whereas worldly grief produces death. For a lot of people, they get stuck in their grief. A lot of people, they feel badly about the choice they made, and they know, I should be doing this, and I didn't do it, and now I feel guilty, and I feel worse about myself, and because I feel worse about myself, I go and make another bad choice, and I feel worse about myself again, and this is an endless cycle of worldly grief where it gets us no place. There's no motion attached to it at all. All there is guilt. And there are people today who try to make us feel guilty. It's not that we're not guilty, we are. But through Jesus, there's salvation. Through Jesus, there's another chance. And so in the story today, the prodigal son last week had said, Dad, I can do this on my own. I don't need you. Give me my money and let me go and do my thing. And he runs as fast as he can, as far as he can, away from his father, away from his roots. And he gets over here, and he lives it up, and for a season it's good. But then for a season, it gets really bad. And he had a choice to make. I can resent Dad because he was right all along. Or I can metanoia, I can change my mind. I can turn back 180 degrees and say there needs to be genuine repentance in my life. There needs to be godly sorrow in my life. And so he starts to come back. And I imagine that journey back was full of him practicing what he was going to say when he saw his father. Because before he had pride, he didn't want to admit his flaws. And so he's coming back and he's rehearsing in his mind, what am I going to say and how's Dad going to respond and what's this going to look like? And I'm sure he's not walking very briskly. He's probably taking his time and not looking forward to that encounter. But as he gets a far way off, he sees his dad waiting. And eventually he sees his dad starting to come towards him. And he starts to now run at a brisker pace towards his dad. And the closer they get, the faster he runs until the pace that he's running at now far exceeds the pace with which he ran away from his father. Because God awakens in us the possibility and even the probability that life can start over with him.